Hi, I'm John Hornick. Welcome to lesson 74 of Chef's Apprentice, learning to cook like a pro, one small plate at a time. This lesson is plum and apple stuffed caramelized pork tenderloin. Here you will learn to make a fruit stuffing and to stuff a pork tenderloin. Fruit and pork are meant for each other. The finished pork will be medium, slightly pink in the middle, about 135 to 140 degrees Fahrenheit internal temperature. The challenges here are to stuff the pork and to make the caramel glaze, not to overcook the pork, and the stuffing simply takes patience and perseverance. Techniques today are peeling, coring, dicing, seeding, and chopping, trimming pork tenderloin, seasoning and sautéing, making a stuffing and stuffing a pork tenderloin, bringing to a boil and making a caramel glaze, tempering and whisking, searing, browning, roasting, and finishing in the oven, resting and slicing, and plating. So let's start cooking. Okay, let's talk about the mise en place for lesson 74. The star of this show is pork tenderloin. And the pork tenderloins, the description calls for 2 of them to make small plates for 8 people. They should be about 1 1/4 to 1 1/2 pounds each. They should be about the same size and shape. And so one of them would be about this big, all right? I've already cut it in half. I'll talk a bit more about that later on. And they need to be trimmed of their extra fat and silverskin. I've trimmed one of them. I'll trim the other one a little bit later. In addition to the pork, we're going to need 1 large peeled, cored, and seeded Granny Smith apple cut into an 1/8" dice. That's pretty small, 1/8" dice. Now, I use Granny Smith apples mostly because they don't brown very fast. You can use really any apple that you want, but they're going to brown pretty quickly. Now, if you're dicing them and cooking them pretty much at the same time, that shortly before you're going to be stuffing the pork, you don't really need to worry about that. Also, you're going to be stuffing the pork, so maybe you don't care about whether the apple's going to get sautéed. So maybe you don't care that much about whether the apples start to turn brown. But if you use an apple other than Granny Smith, and you dice it fairly long in advance before you're sautéing and stuffing the pork, then you can toss that apple in a little bit of lemon juice, and that'll keep it from browning or slow down the browning process. You also need to have 2 large plums that have also been peeled and diced into a small 1/8" dice. You need to have about 2 medium to large shallots that have been finely chopped. You need to have some olive oil. You need to have about 1 cup of sugar, and also about 1/2 cup of sherry wine vinegar. This comes in all different levels of quality. I wouldn't use the cheapest sherry vinegar. I'd use something that's not the most expensive, not the cheapest, something that's in between. We'll need about 1/2 cup of that. We'll need to have 4 fresh rosemary sprigs and some kosher salt and peppermint. All right, that's all of the ingredients. We'll break, come back, and I'll show you the equipment for lesson 74. Now for lesson 74, we're going to need a cutting board, chef's knife. We'll also need to have a boning knife, and it's important to use a boning knife for this. It needs to be sharp, and it needs to be a boning knife because we want the blade to be narrow. It's only like 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch wide when it comes to a point. We're going to use that to cut a slit in the pork so that we can fill the pork. We also need to have a slicing knife, a peeler to peel the apple and the plum. We will need to have a sauté pan and a wooden spoon, and a spoon to press the filling into the pork. You can also use something that's more blunt, like the end of a knife, like this, or the end of the peeler. And you're going to use whatever works best for you, because getting the filling into the pork, it takes a little effort and perseverance, and it can be frustrating at times. So you need to use whatever works for you. Okay, then we'll need to have a saucepan and a wooden spoon to make the glaze, a brush to brush the glaze onto the pork, a sizzle plate to finish the pork in the oven, and then we're going to either cover it with foil. If you've been watching long enough, you know I reuse foil and I try not to waste foil. So you can either use foil, or when you're resting the pork, instead of putting foil over it, you can just put another sizzle plate over it. Okay, then we'll need to have a spoon for plating, And you also want to preheat your oven to 450 degrees. I'm not going to show that as a step in the lesson, so that's actually part of your equipment. So preheat your oven to 450 degrees. Okay, that's all the equipment. We'll break, come back, and start cooking. Okay, now we're going to saute the shallots and the plums and the apples. Medium heat. And medium heat, you know, is almost always what you want. If you're trying to sear, you need higher heat. You need about 1 to 2 tablespoons of olive oil. We're going to put the shallots in the pan. Put the apples in the pan. Now, with some other things, when we're trying to get a brown, we don't crowd the pan, because, like with mushrooms, because they will sweat and they won't brown real well. But it doesn't really matter with what we're doing today, because it's going to be a filling for the pork. We're going to give it some salt and some pepper. Then stir it up. Get all of those vegetables and fruit coated with the olive oil. And then we're going to cook them until just before we start to lose the shape of this brunoise, of this 1/8" dice. So they might take on a little color. Plums might get a little darker. Shallots might take on a little bit of color. But we don't want it to get pasty, like we don't want it to get like applesauce. We want it to maintain some of its form, some of its shape. Okay, so we're hearing some nice sizzling now, and we're starting to see a little bit of color on the fruit and vegetables. So what we're going to do now is take it off the heat and let it cool to room temperature. Now, could you have kept cooking it till it got kind of pastier? Yes, you could. But my personal opinion is that if you cook it only long enough that the brunoise maintains its shape, it looks better in the presentation after you have stuffed the pork and sliced the pork and plated it and served it. Okay, we're going to turn off the heat and remove it from the heat and let it cool to room temperature before we try to stuff the pork with it. Okay, so let's make our glaze. We're going to bring to a boil 1/4 cup of water with the sugar, and we're going to start that on just medium heat and keeping a good eye on it. We want it to brown. Alright, so we're getting some boiling around the edges here, and as long as you keep stirring and keep an eye on it, you can let it boil like that. But if you're going to walk away at all, reduce the heat and stir it as often as you can. Again, we want this to brown, so we're going to stir it and watch it until it browns. Okay, so we've got a nice brown going on here. What we're going to do is turn off the heat. Now, what I want you to do is I want you to take it away from the heat. But rather than changing my camera setup, I'm turning off the heat, putting a heat diffuser underneath of it, and I'm moving it off of the burner a little bit, okay? But what I want you to do is take it away from the heat, all right? We've got a nice brown syrup there, okay? Now what we want to do is we want to temper in this vinegar. I want to pour the vinegar down the side a little bit at a time and stir. And you're going to get a lot of steam off it, so watch out for that hot steam, all right? If it starts to seize up, you can put it back on the burner on medium or medium to low heat. But I'm going to put a little bit of this in there at a time. You can see how hot it is. You can see that steam coming off of there, right? But as we temper that, that sherry vinegar in there, it is raising the temperature of the sherry vinegar, and it's lowering the temperature of the syrup. Okay, you keep stirring it, Now I think we have enough of it in there. Now we can just pour the rest in. Okay? And we just want to stir that up and then keep it warm until we're about ready to use it as a glaze. Remember, if it starts to seize up while you're doing that, stop pouring in the vinegar, put it on back on the heat, and stir it on the heat until it loosens up and becomes a syrup again. See the beautiful color. Okay, according to our prep list, we now need to portion the pork tenderloins. Now, I have enough here to make for 4 people. If you were making for 8, you'd obviously have twice this much. Now, we're going to put a slit down the middle of the pork so that we can stuff them. But to make that easier, what we can do is we can portion the pork into the amount that you would have for each person. So since I'm making 4, that would mean just simply cutting these in half, and then that will make it easier to fill them. Now I'm going to cut them at a little bit of an angle because it just looks better. And then we're going to start at the wider end, and we're going to make an incision that goes right down through the pork. Now, make sure you don't cut through the sides, okay? We just want this slit to go through the middle and for a knife to come out the other end in the middle. Then we're going to do a crossed version of that, so we have a slit running in both directions. Now we're going to do that for all 4 of these pieces of tenderloin, starting at the wider end. Now, you may have done something like a stuffed chicken breast where you cut it from the side and kind of make a butterfly and then put whatever you're stuffing it with inside and then close it back up. You could do that here, but this makes a better presentation if you don't cut through the sides and you put the slit just down the middle. Now what we're going to do is season these pork pieces with some salt and pepper. I'm going to salt the ends as well. Now what we're going to do is the fun part, and that is stuffing the tenderloins. So we're going to take some of our mixture that we used that we made earlier, and we're going to just press it into these holes, and we want to basically fill up each one of these tenderloins. Now this will take a little bit of work. Now you might also be able to do this with a pastry bag or a makeshift pastry bag by using a Ziploc bag and filling the Ziploc bag with this mixture and then cutting off the end of it. We did that in a prior lesson. But that may be easier. The problem is that the mixture may get caught at the end of that bag and kind of jam up. So I'm just going to do it this way. Now, as I said in the introduction part, use whatever works for you. Now, I'm using a spoon. If you think you'd be better off to use, say, the butt of a knife, that's fine. But what you want to do is you want to get the stuffing to go basically all the way through, and pick up what you missed, what you dropped, and use that. All right, the next thing is to brush these pork tenderloin pieces with olive oil. We want to get a nice coating over each one of the pieces, and on the ends and all around. Okay, now we're going to cook the pork pieces according to the pork tenderloin master recipe. Now remember, the way that works, and by the way, I'm doing 4. If you were doing 8, you'd either need to do them in batches or you'd need to use a larger pan, obviously. Now, pork tenderloin master recipe is to sear the pieces in a hot pan, then to put them into the oven for 9 minutes at 450 degrees. Remember, you preheated your oven already to 450, and then to turn them and to roast them 3 more minutes. Now, because these pieces are kind of small, these pork tenderloins are kind of small, I'm going to modify that master recipe just a little bit and do 7 minutes and turn them and do 3 minutes more. So what we want to do is we want to brown these all around before we finish them in the oven. Okay, we have seared them all around. Now, what I'm going to do is turn off the heat, and I'm going to do this next step under the camera. What I want you to do is remove them from the heat area to do this. Okay, we just don't want them to keep cooking. What we're going to do is brush them now with the glaze. Okay, now, according to the pork tenderloin master recipe, we're going to put these into the oven. We can do it in a pan if your pan is oven safe. Otherwise, you can transfer these to a sizzle plate. We're going to put these into the oven for, master recipe says 9 minutes at 450 degrees. Because these are a little smaller, I'm going to do 7 minutes, then we're going to turn them. Okay, it's been 7 minutes. What we're going to do now is brush them again. Okay, then we're going to add the rosemary sprigs. Why didn't we do this earlier? Because they would have burned, okay? So we only want them to be in there for the last 3 minutes. Now we're going to put this back into the oven for 3 minutes. Okay, it's been 3 minutes. We're taking them out of the oven. We're now going to let them rest for 2 to 3 minutes covered. Now you can cover it with foil. I roasted them. I finished them in the oven in the same pan where I seared them. So I'm not going to use a sizzle plate. So I'm just going to put a lid over this and let them rest for about 2 or 3 minutes. Okay, now it's time to plate. So we're going to take one of our portions of pork tenderloin and we're going to slice it kind of on a diagonal. All right, you can see the filling there. It's perfect. It's just slightly pink, medium. And then we're going to take some of the pan roasting juices. This is really kind of glaze plus some of the vegetables that escaped from the stuffed pork tenderloin. We're going to put, just a little pool of that in the center of the plate. And then we want to arrange the pork artfully and garnish with a piece of rosemary. And there we have it. That's lesson 74, plum and apple stuffed caramelized pork tenderloin. You can see photos of the final dish at my Instagram, which is @chefsapprentice, cook like a pro. Next up is lesson 75, 3/4 of the way through this course. And that lesson is New York strip sashimi with citrus dipping sauce and garlic chips. Please remember to subscribe to my channel, and thanks for watching.